Hello again, and welcome back to Life as a Scale Model. This week we're going to be working on sanding and filling and painting our model. As you can see, I have a few pictures of some sandpaper here. I've decided this time around we're going to use a few varied types of sandpaper just to get a nice smooth effect on the surface of our model. So I've got a 120 grit and a 600 grit put aside. Now here's what we were left with after we got through with the building process. I'm happy to report that my little break it till it's not broken anymore actually worked. So now all I need to do is get some of those areas that don't line up quite so well sanded down. And you can see I added another sandpaper to the mix. That's my 1000 grit sandpaper. That's just a really fine grit sandpaper that's going to help us to get a real smooth finish on that model surface. Now, the rule of thumb when you're using sandpaper is the smaller the number, the heavier the grit. And the bigger the number, the more fine the grit is. So right now I'm using my 120 grit, and that's pretty coarse. But I will gradually step up from the 600 to the 1000, and as I step up the number, the grit gets more and more fine, and that leaves far less noticeable gashes in the surface of the model. When I did the previous NX-01, I actually only used the 120 grit. I like the 120 grit because it's really, at least at this scale, it's really a nice happy medium between a really coarse, say like 60 grit sandpaper and a really fine, say 3 or 4000 grit sandpaper, where you're wet sanding shades of maybe, I don't know, thousandths of an inch or something. But as we progress along in these videos, we are going to progressively also try to improve and build upon the techniques that we use when we are building these models, so that we can build them to look as nice and as clean as possible. You can see me here. I'm using my hobby knife just to score the panel lines that are in that ring on the saucer section. I didn't want to lose that detail because I had, sanded down pieces of plastic stuck in it. So I'm just making sure that it looks real sharp and that it shows up against everything else. As I sand, I want to mention a few things because you will have noticed by the thumbnail that this is a much longer video than what I've been typically doing. And there's definitely a reason for that. When I started the channel, not very long ago at all, I wanted to make the concise and kind of the benchmark series of videos for building these 12500 scale models. And I realized that although my previous videos have been pretty short, I also have done a lot of jumping straight from the beginning of the process to the end of the process in some regards, particularly in painting. And my biggest concern has been that I did not want to bore my audience with the dulcet tones of my voice, and so try to keep it very concise and get it done and just be done. But that does cut you guys out of a lot of the process. So we are going to take an awful long time today watching me sand things so that you can get a much better idea of just what is involved behind the scenes when you are building a model. Building a model is not meant to be a very quick process. It's something that is meant to challenge. It's something that is designed by its very nature to take a lot of time if you're trying to do it as well as possible. And so if you find yourself asking the good Lord for patience, then congratulations, you have found the right hobby, because model building will definitely help you to build the skill of being patient. You just have to accept that the process is an involved one that just takes a lot of time, but I find it relaxing mostly because I can sit. You guys don't get to hear it because I would get copyright strikes up the wazoo, but I like to sit in my studio while I build and play loud music and sing along, mostly badly, and focus on the task in front of me. And it really does help me to kind of step outside my everyday life and get away from all of the things that might be bugging me or that demand my time that I just want to not think about for a while. So if you're on the fence about getting into the hobby, being as transparent as possible, I would say consider how much patience you have, whether or not you want to try that patience and build that patience, and also decide for yourself whether or not you want to invest the time that it takes in order to achieve the results that you might be looking to get. There are alternatives to our more traditional scale modeling. For example, the Gundam models have gotten quite popular in recent years, and having built a couple of those over my long and not as illustrious as I would like career in model building, I can say that they are somewhat challenging to build, but they're challenging in different ways than our more traditional plastic models that you'll see me working on this channel, in the sense that you don't need a lot of the early buy-ins. You don't need glue. Typically, you don't need paint. You don't need decal solvent and things like that because you're primarily working either with stickers or rub-on decals. But you do have to follow instructions very, very precisely because most of those kits are made in Japan, and Japan is extremely particular about being precise. And so when you're building those models, one thing that surprised me about them is they can be very multi-layered. You might be building a structure inside another structure, and if you don't follow those instructions to the T, then your model is not going to come out looking the way it's supposed to, and it actually may not even go together properly at all. And so if you don't want to get mired down by all of the initial buy-in for traditional models, and you don't necessarily want to get bogged down in the lengthy process of building more traditional models, then perhaps you might find that Gundam models are kind of your jam. I personally don't not like them, but they're not my favorite thing to build. They're a little more outside my wheelhouse and outside my skill set, and I like what I like, and I tend not to get off of that beaten path too often. But there's definitely value in that, and I found, especially since the 2020s started up, that they are just everywhere. You can find them at Hobby Lobby. You can find them at most of your reputable mom and pop hobby stores. Hobby Town is going to have them. So if you want to give that a try, I say get a small one and give it a go and see what you think. Back to our sanding. I am deep in the process of sanding the seams down on some of the areas of this model kit. I normally save this for the post-mortem, but I will say here, since we are diving very deeply into the process of building this model, that there were a lot of issues, in my opinion, with seam lines not lining up quite as well as they could. They weren't terrible. I've definitely worked with worse, but they were noticeable, and as you can see, they did take considerable effort to sand down and to get as flush as I could get them. And that's really a shame because some of these areas where I'm sanding, particularly on the ends of these warp nacelles, there's a lot of really great molded in detail, and I didn't want to lose that if I could help it, but it just gets hard not to lose it when you're dealing with seam lines that are pretty well ingrained in the model kit itself and the mold and whatnot. What I will say is if you find yourself with seam lines and you're trying to preserve the detail that the mold has, I will put on my Bob Ross hat here and say, use just very little pressure as you're sanding. Just, light as a feather, just real light pressure when you sand. And that'll help you to only take a little at a time, and you take a little bit and you check it. I like to feel the seams with my thumb and my thumbnail, and if my thumbnail gets caught, then I know my seams are still not where they need to be, and at that point I'll go back, I'll take a little more, and you just do it real light, just light touch, and that'll help you get those seams sanded down without taking off too much of the detail around it. So I'm working on the bottom of the nacelles. Again, another area where the seams just were not super great. And you're going to notice me throughout this entire video trying to figure out how to use these 3 different sandpapers. I apologize. Now what I'm pointing to here, there are divots on the bottom of these nacelles that from the pictures I had found online, I don't believe those divots are supposed to be there. So when we go back to, or when we get to the portion of the build where we fill, I am going to fill those little divots to make them disappear, so that we have a nice, hopefully very smooth surface that doesn't look like it had ever been broken up at all. We'll just make it disappear. I'd say it's like a magic wand, but now you're getting a very transparent look behind the curtain, and as you can probably guess, it's not a magic wand in the sense that it works very immediately. It can take a lot of time and a lot of patience. I'll probably say that word a lot this video, but it can take a lot of time and patience, and once it's done, though, the results typically make the effort worth it. If again you take your time and you just try not to rush things. So I'm just trying to prep the area around it the best I can to make sure that when I actually do fill it, the filler has a little bit to grip onto. That'll prevent it cracking off and flaking off as I sand it down. And I'm taking a lot of time in these little teeny tiny areas. Some people are not going to see a need to put as much time and effort into those as I have, and that's okay. We're all going to build models in different ways. We're all going to just kind of do things the way we want to do them. There's really no right or wrong way to building a model, as long as you're following the instructions, whether you've made them up for yourself or you're following the instructions that come with the kit. And so if you don't want to, jump down these rabbit holes and take a deep dive like I have, then that's okay. Obviously, I'm doing this so I can teach folks proper modeling techniques. And so taking deep dives and going down rabbit holes really helps me to find opportunities to show these different techniques for things. But if you're content with a little bit of a seam line and you're not, trying to win any awards, then I say that's cool. But yeah, the seam lines on the bottom of these nacelles were not great. They just, I don't know, I didn't feel like I could get them super smooth. And that's why I kind of stepped up to from the 120 grit to the 600 and the 1000 grit. I did know at one point, okay, I'm getting to the finish line, so probably I should slow things down a bit. And now I'm just trying to get a little excess glue that leaked out onto that pylon taken care of, Again, I got my hobby knife and I'm scoring that panel line so I don't lose that detail. That's very important to me. It may not be as important to you, but being as these are intended to go onto a very ornate display at some point, I wanted to make sure that everything's looking as good as I can get it. You'll see me redoing the process, repeating the process a lot. And it's because, the one truth in model building is you can remove material, but it's very hard to put it back. So I'm just being overly cautious, trying to make sure that I don't take too much material off of the model while I sand it, so that I'm not left with, weird parts that are deformed or misshapen. Finally, I'm moving on to the engineering hull here and sanding parts of that. That area wasn't too bad. It didn't need a whole lot of work for me to get it to my satisfaction. One thing I will say about this kit and the other NX-01 kit in particular, because it was molded in a metallic color, it sometimes makes it a little hard to get enough contrast while you're looking at the model to see where the model ends and like pieces of sprue begin or pieces of flash begin. So these model kits in particular, it may not be a bad idea to just kind of feel around with your finger or your thumb and see if you've gotten everything removed that needs to be removed. I found it a little bit nerve-wracking because there were bits, of course, that I didn't want removed, but it was very hard to tell where the parts I wanted gone ended and where the parts I wanted kept began. So just keep that in mind if you happen to build this particular model. I've gone around the saucer section, and now I'm back at the front of that nacelle. That's one of those areas where I did notice that there were parts that probably could have been removed, but I just couldn't see them because, again, it's hard with the metallic, reflecting light the way it does. It's kind of hard to get a good enough contrast to notice some of those things. But it's done to my satisfaction, so let's move on to our filling. I'm going to use Tamiya Putty White. It's my go-to filler at this point. I've been using it for years, and this is my trusty hobby knife. You can see it's been through a lot. It's got a lot of colors on it, and it's because it's my favorite putty knife, and I love it dearly. It has a backup, but I'm just going to use that putty knife until the day it becomes so bent and deformed that it just won't do anything anymore. And then maybe I'll decide that it's time to retire it. So we're going to fill those divots. I've just got a little bit on the tip of that rounded end, and I'm going to just work that putty into that divot. I'm not even going to refill the end of that putty knife yet, because the object of the game is to use as little putty as possible to accomplish what you're trying to do. And that way you don't have to go back and sand later. But you can see I thought, well, I need a little bit extra, so I'll get a little bit extra and I'll put it down on that model. And then I'm going to wipe off my putty knife. And I'm actually going to scrape a little of that excess off so that I have less that I need to sand later in order to clean up the model. However you want to do it, whatever works for you. You go ahead and do you. This just happens to be what works for me. I do, after this, off camera, I went back and I filled a couple of seam lines along the boom where the boom meets the warp nacelle pylons. And I also found out, as I inspected very closely, that I had a little bit of a gap between the neck and the saucer. So I tried to fill that. It didn't turn out as great as I would have liked, but it turned out fine. People aren't going to really see that part anyway, it's so small, but you can see here I did put just the least little bit of putty down there to try to fill that gap. And there are my 3 different grits of sandpaper. The tan is 120, one of the blacks is 600, and the other black one is 1000. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes on camera trying desperately to figure out how to organize them so that I don't get confused as I reach for them. That's kind of a new process for me. Like I said, I don't usually use descending grit sandpaper on my models because I'm not typically modeling a car or something like that where you need a super smooth finish on the model itself. But we're trying to teach, good modeling habits here, and folks who tend to get great results also tend to use multiple different sandpaper grits in order to get those results. And so here we are, making our lives difficult on purpose in the pursuit of an amazing looking model. You can see I'm having a little trouble figuring out how to attack that filler, and every model is going to present the same challenge in a different way. So don't feel bad if you find yourself slogging through the frustration of figuring out just the right angle from which to attack that filler and get it all sanded down, because we've all been through it and we all know the pain. But once you figure it out, it goes pretty quick. And again, just like when I was sanding the actual model itself, a lot of that frustration stems from wanting to make sure that I don't inadvertently take out detail that I want to remain on the model, which is why I've got my pick and I'm scribing that warp nacelle pylon again. And I'll also, once I actually finish sanding, I'll go back with that pick and I'll look at the boom and I'll clear out the panel lines on the boom that I want to have show up on the model as well. Now I've got that 600 grit sandpaper and I'm just lightly going over that to smooth out the plastic and the filler a bit. And here we are, scribing those panel lines just to make sure they still show up when we get everything sprayed. These are little things you have to think about as you're working. You can see I'm also having trouble with my sandpaper. I don't know. I just couldn't figure out a comfortable way to fold that sandpaper so that it would be stiff enough to work more like a file and also hold itself together. So I'm just going to struggle bus it and do the best I can under the circumstances. You'll see me tear sandpaper in half, refold it in different ways like I'm trying to do something with origami, and that's just me trying to figure out how to use those tools in the most comfortable way for me. And that's going to be something that is different for every individual. And so as you're working, you just go ahead and, if your gut tells you, hey, this isn't working for me, then you just go ahead and try something different until you find something that works well for you. That's just part of the process when it comes to working on models. You just work through trial and error to figure out what works for you, and once you find something that does work, you stick with it until you come across a model that it doesn't work on, and then you go back and you figure it all out again. That's ironically, though, that's part of the fun of the challenge behind model building of this type. There's a lot of problem solving involved, and so if you like puzzles and you like to solve problems, then you probably won't have too much to say about that process. You probably won't hate it so much as some others. If you got an attention span problem like I do, it might be a different story, but just do the best you can. So now I got those panel lines scribed, and yes, I'm rearranging my sandpaper. I might eventually figure out how that works best for me. We'll see. We still got 13 more of these rascals to build, so I have plenty of time. But I'm going over the leading and trailing edges of that pylon because I thought I saw a seam line there where it had been molded with a seam in it. Not a big one. That's why I'm using the really fine grit sandpaper, but just enough that it was noticeable to my eye. So now that I finished the boom for that warp nacelle, I'm going to go back and figure out my sandpaper situation, and then I will sand the putty off of that, the excess putty off of that warp nacelle. And again, I'm just trying to get that sandpaper folded up so it's stiff enough to use more like a file. I haven't actually taken the time to check, but it might make your life easier if it exists. You might be able to get metal files with varying grits. I know you can get like emery board kind of files that have different grits, and I've looked into getting those. It's just not something I've gotten around to. Everything that I get at this point, the channel has to pay for, so I'm just trying to work within my budget, and you're going to find yourself in the same position, and that's all right. If you can afford the varying different grit emery board files, then I say go for the Gusto, because it's just going to make your life easier. Right, so here I found there's a little bit of a wing on that outer edge of the nacelle, and I found I'd found some filler that had gotten stuck in between that little area and the actual nacelle, and so I just took my pick and picked it out. Now we're just descending our grit number and getting finer and finer so that we can clean it up and make it as smooth as we can make it. I'm giving it a real good look because I'm onto this model. I've noticed how, it makes it a little difficult to tell what's going on the surface in some areas. Can't complain too much. This is a relatively new model. The kit this one came out of only came out last October. That would be October 2024 for anybody who's watching this post 2025. And so this is a really new model in terms of model kits. And so I was really surprised to see, the seam problems that I found and the various fitment issues that I will discuss in more detail when we actually finish the model and I do the post-mortem. But even with all the warts, it's still a really enjoyable kit to build so far. Part of the difficulties I've had with it, we can definitely attribute to the fact that I may have been trying to work a bit more quickly than I usually do. And that's mostly down to things in personal life that were going on that took away some of the time I would normally have to work on channel stuff and then still having a self-imposed channel deadline. But I really can't complain at all about this model. And now, right before we get into the thick of finding out how I dealt with the filler that I put between the saucer, the neck and the engineering hole, my camera battery died. That was really my bad. You guys can roast me in the comments over that, but I swear it turned out fine. So now that my camera is recharged, we're going to go ahead and we're going to prime. I'm working backwards from the process I used with the first NX because I had a little bit of it ended up being unnoticeable at the end, but I had a little bit of a snafu as I was spraying the NX. I think it was with the gloss coat before I put on the decals, but I had sprayed the gloss coat on the dorsal side of things, the top side of things, and I turned it over to spray the ventral side, or the bottom, and it had just barely stuck to my little turntable, and it made a little deformation on the saucer dome. So what I decided at that point, as I gave it a thought about, okay, how do I avoid that, is, oh, well, if I spray the bottom side first, I can use that stand that AMT graciously provided for me, and once the bottom is dry, I can place it on the stand and I can spray the top, and then the model doesn't have to be in contact with the turntable, which you can see has been sprayed many a time. So if you find yourself with those kinds of problems, then you heard it here first, and you're welcome. But, work out whatever solutions you can work out. Again, problem solving is definitely a part of the game when you're building scale models. Have fun with it. Try not to see it as a frustration, but see it as an opportunity to expand your horizons and explore that final frontier, your own personal final frontier of, figuring out how to build models better. So now we're going to get into the paints, and you can see I have two different brands of paints that I've put together here. Those just happen to be the brands that I had the colors I wanted for. We are going to start with the sensor dome on the bottom, because that's where I started with the last one. So I'm going to take my Vallejo brand Ivory, which I think, in my personal opinion, is a perfect match to sensor domes in the Enterprise and TOS era. And then we're going to take my new discovery, my Vallejo thinner medium, and we're going to put those on the palette. And I use the thinner medium because I have noticed that Vallejo paints, the ones you get at least for brush painting, tend to be on the thick side. And sometimes that's not a big deal, but other times it really can mess with the dispersal of the pigments in the suspension liquid. So if you're having that problem, just get yourself an appropriate thinner medium, and that'll take care of that. So now I'm just going to very carefully start painting over my base coat on the sensor dome area. You'll notice that I had a big boo-boo there, and I cheated a little bit. I actually took a Q-tip and just cleaned it off and redid it. Now we're going to work on the brass elements. There are two deflector dishes on this ship. It's very singular in that particular area. So I started with the saucer, or the deflector dish on the engineering hull, and then I moved to the engineering, or the can't talk, and then I moved to the saucer on the, or the dish on the saucer. It's hard to tell from the picture, but there are two little strips that run along the outer edge of the saucer section here, where the navigation running lights are. Those are the green and blue ones. And as I was looking at my source material in the Haynes manual, I noticed that they were a grayish color. The picture will tell you that I used German gray, and that is not entirely untrue, but I thought it might be a little too dark at this scale, and so I found London gray, which is a shade lighter, and I went ahead and redid it with that. And I'd recommend the London gray. It looked real good. Now we're going to do silver. And you may be wondering, well, Casey, why are you doing silver when the whole thing is pretty much silver anyway? And I'm just going to sit on that one for a little while. I'm going to teach you a little something that experienced modelers have learned over the years that may or may not blow your mind depending on how much experience you have. But it's just a little something I learned years and years ago that I tend to do, especially on these littler models, that yields some really good results and creates a really cool effect on the model after you get done with it. You can see I'm trying real hard to keep my hand steady so I get the paint just where I want it. Now I'm going to paint the warp engine chiller grills. On the original NX, this was double the pain because, of course, the warp chiller grills were on both the inboard and the outboard side of the nacelle. But good old Doug Drexler, he did us a solid when he designed this one, and he did away with the outboard warp chiller grills, and instead we just have inboard warp chiller grills. So I only had to do this twice. And I'm working on things like camera angles and improving the presentation of my videos. You may have noticed my picture-in-picture action and my helpful little arrows pointing to what area of the ship I'm painting at the moment. And another thing that I will have to work on is finding a camera angle where you guys can actually see what I'm doing. But imagine in your minds that I am using the steadiest, most practiced hand you can possibly imagine, and then reverse that. I'm just really all I'm doing is I'm just trying very hard to run the brush down the length of the warp chiller grill and not get blue paint anywhere that it's not supposed to be. Sometimes I'm successful in that endeavor and other times I'm not. But you can see I was less than successful here. I got some paint where it wasn't supposed to go. But you know what? That's all right. We're gonna take care of that later. So now we're gonna paint. There's a little black ring that works its way around the hull right before you hit the Bassard collectors, and it's a little bit recessed from the rest of the hull. So I'm just taking my black and I'm very carefully working my way around the nacelle and putting black paint on that ring. And what's good about it is it's just a straight line, so if you can keep your hand pretty steady, then you shouldn't have too much trouble making that thing work. If you don't have the steadiest of hands, I have good news for you. It is possible to get your hands to be more steady with practice. And, you know, barring being able to do that, if you still don't find yourself capable of keeping your hands steady, I have good news for you. If you work with a color that has both a spray and a pot component to it, you just buy a pot of whatever color you're spraying for your base coat and you can paint over it. That's something we're going to cover later. But luckily, those paint people were smart. They knew some of us would have shaky hands and wouldn't be able to paint things as nicely as we'd like. So you see, we got that little black ring painted, and it's looking pretty good. Now we're going to move on to the warp nacelles Bassard collectors. And I've opted to paint these gunmetal. Gunmetal is like a dark blackish silver color. It's definitely a metallic color. It's kind of hard to describe. If you go online, you can probably find pictures of what it looks like. I'll show you what I've done after I get done doing it. But we're painting this for the same reason that we painted the silver earlier. And so that's all I'm really going to say about that, except to say that I may or may not have touched the model with my greasy fingers at some point in the Bassard collector area, and for that reason I did have a little trouble getting the paint to stick to the surface of the model because of the oils that transferred off my fingers to the surface of the model itself. So if you don't want to have that problem in your life and you want to spare yourself a little bit of a headache, I would recommend picking yourself up a box of rubber gloves to wear while you work, because rubber gloves aren't greasy, and so you won't have that transference of oils and greases off your fingers and stuff. Also, if you're like me and you like to flail around like you're epileptic, you may find yourself putting your hands in places that get paint on them, and then you put your fingers and your hands all over your model and you transfer paint onto your model that's not supposed to be there. And rubber gloves can definitely save you from that particular headache as well. So I'm a firm believer in rubber gloves, and at some point in the very near future, I intend the channel to buy some because they are a lifesaver. And I'm not sure why I haven't done that already. You can see I'm working around as carefully as I can. What you can't see, even though you do get a little bit of a glimmer of my ugly mug, is that I'm wearing my old man glasses. That's another recent addition trick of the trade that I've started doing, probably since I graduated out of my 30s, but I got some reading glasses. Excuse me, I got me some reading glasses, and now I use them when I paint because it helps me see details a lot more easily. Not that my eyes suffer or are incapable of seeing the details in the first place, just helps me see them more easily, which I appreciate, and it makes things look bigger, which in my brain makes them easier to paint. So that's what I was doing just now, I was putting them up on top of my head. But now you can see I've taken that gunmetal and I've painted that whole Bussard collector area with that gunmetal. And it's a dark metallic. And like I said, you'll find out in a few minutes why I did that. So now you're going to see, I guess. Should have checked that. I've got me some Tamiya Clear Red here. And then I also got some Tamiya Clear Green. And I'm sure at this point you can tell where things are headed. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the Clear Red on the port side of the ship, or the left side of the ship. And then I'm going to put the Clear Green on the starboard side, or the right side of the ship. And when you paint the translucent colors over the silver, it lends itself to a bit of an illusion that those areas that are supposed to be lighted are actually lit. It's not super convincing if you get real up close, but we're not trying to make it super convincing. We just want our models to pass the 2-foot test. We want them to look good from 2 feet or more, right? And so you paint that silver, and then you put those translucent colors over, and it just kind of makes it look like they've got a light behind them. And that's the trade secret that a lot of more experienced modelers than myself turned me on to several years ago. And I liked the results I got the first time or two that I did it, so I just kept on doing it, and here we are. I'm attempting here to use the same level of care and precision that I used when I painted the silver, so that I don't get the translucent paint anywhere that it's not supposed to go, because I would hate to have to paint over it. And the reason I would hate to do that is because, much like old Bob used to say, a thin paint will stick to a thick paint. A gloss paint will stick to a matte paint, but a matte paint will not stick to a gloss paint so well. And the translucent colors are definitely gloss. But you can see there, they stand out pretty good, and at little 2500 scale, they give the illusion of being lit. And now you're going to see the payoff of why it is that I use the gunmetal on the Bussard collectors, because I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to use this clear orange to paint over the gunmetal. And the reason I use the gunmetal is I was looking around on the internet, because this one here, doesn't have an entry in the Haynes model since it was only canonized in 2023 or 2024. And what I found was there were definitely some renders where the Bussard collectors were orange. Doug Drexler's original render of it had, well, it didn't have the little brass-colored antennas coming out of the front, and also the Bussard collectors were still red, but they were more translucent red, and they were rather dark. In my head, I like the idea that we had the NX class, and then after the Romulan Wars, the NX class ships got this massive upgrade where they started to take on a resemblance of the Constitution class that we would see later on down the road. And so the NX Refit kind of becomes like a stepping stone between the NX class and the Constitution class. And for that reason, I decided to go ahead and paint these Bussard collectors orange. But I also liked the look that Doug Drexler had when the collectors were not very brightly lit, because in my mind the warp core is not as powerful, and so those Bussard collectors are not working as hard, and they don't necessarily need to be as bright. And so there you have it. Mystery solved. Casey was just trying to do a really cool effect with that translucent orange, and we'll see how that turns out at the end. But you can see here it does look pretty good, and it does give it a little bit of a glow. Now I'm going to use titanium gold, and I'm going to paint primarily that bridge dome. There are a couple other little greeblies on the saucer that are also titanium gold, and then there's a little section down on the engineering hull that has a bit that's titanium gold, and you can see those when I take some final pictures of the finished product. One thing I was not ready for was how light the titanium gold looks when you paint it on. I'm not sure why it looks so light, but at times it actually looked like I hadn't painted anything at all on there. So just be aware, if you're going to go this route on this particular model, that it's probably not going to look like you painted anything. But I promise, if you follow my procedures, it will eventually work itself out, and you'll have a lovely looking effect all over your model. It'll look great. So now I'm going to paint the copper rings that go all the way around the warp nacelles. This is a great feature of the NX that I really like, because that could have just been, dead space that blended with the rest of the ship, and I don't think anybody would have complained. But Doug Drexler is just really keen on putting little details here and there that pop out from whatever's around it in order to give his designs a little bit more flair, and also to make them a little bit more visually interesting to the viewer who happens to be watching whatever it is that he worked on as a 3D modeler. And so he added these little copper coils around the warp nacelles, and they do really pop against the rest of the model itself. So just like the black ring that I did, I'm just very carefully trying to go around this one and put the paint where I want it. These are raised from the rest of the hull. So if you've got a steady hand, they're not terribly difficult to do. If you don't have a steady hand, we've got a pot full of titanium silver, which was the base coat color I did, and we can fix it later. So yeah, that would be my plug for using base coat colors, especially if you're using rattle cans or spray paint cans, as they sometimes call them when they're not modelers. Use a base coat color that also has a counterpart that you can brush, and that'll save you a lot of headache when it comes to fixing up your model and making it look really good, and fixing those boo-boos that you make when paint accidentally goes places that you don't want it to be. It is possible, while the paint is still wet, to take a wet Q-tip and scrub things off, and then you take the dry end and dry it. But sometimes you're in a rush or you don't notice, and that's when you use the touch-up paint. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So here's my finished product with the ring around the warp nacelle. And again, you see how that just pops from the rest of the model there, and it's just lovely. So now we're going to use my Sky Blue, which I checked today, and unfortunately Sky Blue only comes in gloss. And again, a gloss will stick to a flat, but a flat will not stick to a gloss as well. So use that knowledge however you may. But what I'm doing here, there's a little area on the back end of the saucer where there are two little blue dome looking things. So I'm just painting these little details as I see them. And then there's also a spot on the engineering hull that has kind of the same detail to it. You may be wondering why our picture was showing the back end of the ship. And the reason is we're going in for round 2 with those impulse engines. If you've watched my build of the previous NX model, you'll know that I was fixated on the idea of trying to paint the impulse engines on that model. And the reason I wanted to do that is because it's kind of a large detail, so I didn't think it would be terribly hard to do. But when I did it on the previous model, I used the wrong brush. And if you know your Star Trek, you'll know that Scotty has told us in his infinite wisdom that we should use the right tool for the right job, which I definitely did not do. So I'm going in for round 2 to see if I can redeem myself as soon as I finish painting behind the front deflector dish here on the saucer section, because that is backlit with a light blue if you watch the show or if you look at images on the internet or whatever. And so I wanted to capture that detail as well. But I will say, before we even jump into the post-mortem for the next video, one thing I did not notice, probably because of the lack of contrast on the surface of the model, was just how poorly the seams were fitted on that impulse engine area. So they were a little bit rough, and I kind of had to work around that, but I made the best of it. And when I finally show off the finished product and you get to see all the hard work that went into it and all the details I tried to cover, you can see for yourself how that turned out and decide for yourself if it's worth the headache for you to do that. It was worth it to me. I'm still thinking of more effective ways to do that. I'm toying with the idea of maybe, using a mask or something. But you can see I got a lot of that sky blue in the areas where I wanted it to go. You can see those little blue domes. They're nice. So here's my hard pitch for using a base coat color that you can spray that also has a pot based counterpart. There was a little slop when it came to my sky blue there on the saucer, so I'm just going to take some of that titanium silver, that's the base coat color I used, I'm just going to paint over that, which is a little misleading because actually what went on here, I had bought this pot off of Amazon. It turns out it was really old. It was so old that all of the pigments had clumped together and settled at the bottom, and I didn't know that. So here I am trying to figure out why the heck this thing isn't painting the way it's supposed to paint, despite the fact that I had put in some lead BBs in it and shook it up real good. Didn't work. If it's all clumped at the bottom, it's not going to do anything. So always try to stir your new pots of paint with a stir stick or something to make sure that you've got all that pigment dispersed throughout the paint. Otherwise you're going to get bad results. I did go back later after I got it all worked out and I fixed everything. But you can see here it's a little discolored. I may actually go back and repaint that before I spray it. Now we're going to finally paint the antennas on the front of the Bussard collectors. This will be a little bit of a spoiler because you'll get a little glimpse of what the fully painted model looks like. But I am going to be a bit of a tease because I want you to come back for another video. I'm going to withhold a full reveal until we get all the decals on. And just a word of warning, being absolutely as fair as possible, I may dive as deeply into the decaling process as I did with the painting process, because again, I feel like people should know what they're getting into when it comes to scale modeling, but also because I really want this to, be a benchmark series for people to visit or revisit if they decide to work on these little 2500 scale models. So just worked around each antenna best I could, and made sure that I got everything covered real well. And checking my work here just to make sure I actually got everything. You see I missed a little spot, so I had to go back and fix that. But I do like the end result. You can see it really stands out against those Bassart collectors. That's going to do it for this video. I appreciate you all sticking with. If you've gotten this far, please leave a like and go subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. And till I see you again, have a blessed day and happy modeling.